Hi, my name is Alexia Contreras de Castillo, and the research topic we chose for today is a common recommendation of education reform advocates is to increase the number of charter schools that receive public funding but operate independently from the rules that govern most other public schools. We chose this topic because we believe education is an important issue in public policy today. And one of the most debated topics in education reform is, do charter schools enhance student learning compared to public schools? So an independent variable for this question is whether or not a school is chartered or public. And a dependent variable is if students' learning is enhanced, and that's measured by SAT scores. The unit of analysis for this is national. We'll be pulling 500 charter schools and 500 public schools from across the United States, 10 from each state of each.
Hi, I'm Micahel Johnson, and I'll be presenting our hypothesis and our theoretical expectations. So for our hypothesis, we hypothesize that we expect that charter schools will enhance student learning. This directly leads into our theoretical expectations, which is that charter schools will have higher average SAT scores than public schools. This is very important, especially being in political science. This relates to public policy in that if charter schools are found to raise SAT scores, then more public funding should be directed towards that. Within our research, we're also going to be considering two studies. The first one was found that here in Texas, it was comparing Harmony charter schools to other public schools. This study found, in fact, that charter schools did, in fact, perform better than their peers at public schools. However, there was another study done in the state of Michigan, which Michigan actually has some of the most permissive laws as far as charter school goes. And basically, when comparing, they found that charter schools students actually performed worse on standardized testing. One of the main reasons for this is that it seemed that underperformers in public schools, when looking for the parents, when looking for the ability to possibly raise scores, looked at charter schools as an alternate. Unfortunately, those kids typically would underperform in the charter schools as well. So basically, when gathering this research, this was looking at a state-by-state basis. However, our study will look nationwide.
Hi, I'm Elise Becker, and after we determined our research question, our hypothesis, and outlined our theoretical expectations, our next step was to define our concepts of interest. So defining your concepts of interest is important because it helps to make sure that we as researchers are all on the same page, as well as anyone who might read our feature study knows exactly what we're talking about when we use certain terms. So one of the first important things to define was a public school versus a charter school. A public school is obviously publicly funded, and the curriculum and internal operations are really clearly defined by government, what students need to learn and how they need to be evaluated. Whereas a charter school is also a public school, but it's established by a charter and it's run independently. So the students in that school have greater flexibility as to what the curriculum is and how they're being evaluated, but the trade-off is that they are held to a higher standard and are expected to be achieving higher scores. And then the third important thing to define was enhanced learning, which we mentioned in our hypothesis. For us, enhanced learning was going to be measured as SAT scores and how students did on the SAT, and those scores range between 400 and 1600. So after we finished defining our important terms, we moved on to operationalization, which is really important because that is saying how we're going to be measuring our different variables and how we're actually going to be studying them. So for our independent variable, we had set up a dummy variable for both charter schools and public schools, so it would be two separate regressions that would be run. And then for our dependent variable, we'd be looking at SAT scores, like I said before. And then on top of that, we have some control variables, which basically just help us to make sure that nothing else is accounting for any trends that we see, that we're controlling for different things that could be a factor. So we had four main ones. The first one was class size, which we operationalized as the teacher-student ratio. And class size was important because that way we could see if the size of the class had any influence, and if it was students in smaller classes did better than students in larger classes, and just how that affected everything. The next one was wealth, which we will be measuring with the average household income. And income and wealth are really important because that can help to see if it's a student's background that is influencing their test scores more than what school they go to. So if students can afford to have tutors outside of school, or they're in different activities that might help them. We also looked at race, which was important because a lot of times race is tied to socioeconomic status, and then also can help us just to know different students' backgrounds. And we operationalized that as the percentage of different races in each school. And then the final one was school funding, which we operationalized as the annual amount of money per student in each school. And that's important because that can tell us if it's really the type of education that the student receives, what in a charter school or a public school, or if it's just as simple as how much money and how much funding each school receives.
Hi, I'm Parker Coble, and I'm here to talk about how we're going to test our hypothesis, which, once again, we expect that charter schools will enhance student learning. So to begin, we're going to gather data from 1,000 different schools from around the country, 500 charter schools and 500 public schools. We plan to take 10 of each from each different state. Now these schools will be in varying geographic and have varying sociological differences, and we do this to get the most diverse data as possible to make sure we're not forgetting anything or losing track of any variables. So after we get this data, we would put them into two different regressions. One regression would be for charter schools, to track the scores of charter schools, and the other would be to track the scores of public schools. We would run these regressions through Stata to measure any statistically significant differences between public school educations and charter school educations. And if there are, then we would be able to accurately measure those differences, which would be great in helping us answer or whether or not our hypothesis is correct.
Hi, I'm Bryan. I'm going to be talking about the weaknesses and strengths of this research project that we're putting together. The first weakness that we identified was that elementary and middle schools were not covered in this study, so we don't know how the history of the students' education leading up to high school actually did affect their scores and affect their learning abilities, which could be a big factor that this does not discuss. The second is the definition of enhanced learning is subjective. A lot of people could argue that SAT scores on their own merit don't really show if a child has learned anything, that they can just regurgitate facts and numbers doesn't mean that they've actually been educated. We chose this because it is a standardized way across the nation to measure learning and understanding, but others could argue that that is not the case. Finally, or third, there could be fluctuations in dependent variable over time. Since the study is just looking at 2019 school data, it doesn't cover over 10, 20-year span. So maybe this year was an anomaly. Charter schools had a great group of students that performed really, really well. But in the years to come, public schools actually do outperform. So it doesn't show that long history. It just shows that this year charter schools did better in the long run compared to public, or it'll show vice versa. So you really can't tell the long pattern. You can just tell what happened in this exact school year. Another one is that this doesn't take into account ACT scores. So you'll probably be getting, we don't know the exact percentage, but around half or 50-50, or maybe even more people take ACT than SAT. Don't have that exact number, but you're only getting a smaller percentage of the actual students being educated in both of these schools, which again could be another issue. Like maybe public schools do better on ACTs and charter schools do better on SATs. We don't know. And then how students are selected for charter schools is another thing. Charter schools use a lottery system, whereas students in public schools, it's basically off of district zoning. And so that also could play a big factor. Some strengths is that we do use SAT as a standardized test, a test that's going to be taken across the nation, so we can do a generalizable national study. Another one is that because we're doing a regression, we're able to add control variables to see what's actually doing the work. Is the charter school really, or is the public school really what is enhancing the students' learning or not? Or is it these other factors? And we're able to control for that and make sure that holding all of these equal, whether charter schools or public schools, are what is really pushing the enhancement of learning. And finally, it's generalizable. The data that you find in this study, after it's all run and regressed, the federal government can use to see how effective their public schools are, how effective their charter schools are, and to make public policy decisions from a factual standpoint. So in closing, this is our research project on do charter schools enhance student learning compared to public schools, and this is how we try to tackle and approach this research question. Thank you for listening.